Celebrate 95 years of better appliance shopping at Brand Scarf's anniversary sale. Going on now. Save big on in-stock refrigerators and best-selling washers and dryers. Plus, get savings on top of savings with stackable rebates on select GE Profile and Cafe packages. With nearly a century of expertise, Brand Scarf will always get you the best deal on the best new appliances. So hurry to any of Brand Scarf's convenient locations or shop online at brandscarf.com, where it doesn't cost more to get more.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
Lies, exploitation, and the American dream turned nightmare. This is Big Sugar, a deep dive into the inner workings of the sugar industry. I'm Celeste Headley, and in a new podcast, I'm investigating a true crime story like no other about the men who risked their lives to cut sugarcane. In Big Sugar from iHeartMedia, Imagine Audio, and the teams at Weekday Fun and Novel, I'll unravel a decades-long fight to get justice.
If they were right, then these workers were owed tens of millions of dollars in extra wages.
Listen to Big Sugar wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I want to start today with a kind of almost a little mental thought experiment, and I want you guys to kind of do this with me. We don't often kind of do anything interactive on this podcast, but I want you just to stop for a moment and think of every connotation that you have to the term economic sanctions. When you hear it on the news, when you hear it on whatever you watch, the BBC, CNN, whatever you listen to, what do you think of? What connotations does it have? Does it sound, as I think it's intended to sound, like the kind of almost like the the global north as the kind of the firm but fair disciplinarian taking rogue sort of naughty countries' toys away? Does it sound like the non-violent alternative to war, where countries can be gently induced into some kind of compliant behavior with the rest of the world system? And if it does sound like that, and it's probably meant to sound like that, then it's not like that at all. And the Lancet, the world's premier medical journal, has recently produced statistics of kind of an unimaginable structural violence that is essentially what sanctions are. There's been a study revealed that show that economic sanctions, and there's a lot to say about sanctions. There are United Nations sanctions, and then there are unilateral sanctions, mainly normally pursued by the United States of America, have brought about unimaginable devastation in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So we're going to dive into the report now. So let's have a look. But I think firstly, again, when we're talking about propaganda and the ways in which we're propagandized too, we have to look beyond the sanitized, corporatized language that presents devastating economic action, which is every bit as devastating as open warfare when you look at the numbers of deaths involved. And we need to examine the realities. Just as the kind of ever so charmingly titled structural adjustment programs sounds like something that is there to make people's lives better, doesn't it? We're structurally adjusting your country. It was doing the wrong things. It's going to do the right things now. And the structural adjustment is really about the breaking open of sovereign nations to a global asset class, a global rentier class. And it involves an enormous amount of quite invisible violence that goes with it. When we talk about in countries here in Great Britain, things like austerity, austerity is presented as prudence, as tightening one's belt, being less profligate, less silly spending on fripperies, and more kind of common sense values of thrift and self-reliance. Well, by the last count, and this was a long time ago, it had killed 335,000 people in the UK. So again, we need to look at the numbers. So, to understand this, we're going to look at the Lancet. Now, for those of you who aren't readers of the Lancet, and it would probably none of us are, the Lancet as a medical journal is one that is based on peer review. So that means that you can't just write any old opinion piece in it. It has to be extremely rigorous and evidenced science in this kind of data science that stands up to peer review, that other very, very eminent data scientists in the medical field look at it and say, yeah, I can't find fault with that. So the stuff we're looking at here isn't any old garbage. It is peer reviewed. It is as close to the cutting edge science as we're going to get. It is the most reliable stuff, the reliable evidence we can put our faith in. So the article is called Effects of International Sanctions on Age-Specific Mortality, a cross-national panel data analysis. And I'll put a link to it below. It's in the August 2025 edition of the Lancet. And we're looking at really a landmark study using econometric techniques to demonstrate that there is not a there is not a correlation, but a causal link. These things it's not that two things are happening at the same time and it just happens to be a coincidence. There is causation here between economic sanctions and increased mortality, especially amongst children and older adults, so children and elderly people. So here are the key findings. Okay, the key findings are that sanctions do increase mortality. If your country has economic sanctions placed upon it, then more people will die. Okay, there is a significant causal relationship found between sanctions and higher death rates across all age groups, but it is especially deadly for children under 5 and for older adults between 60 and 80. There is a comparable impact to the global death toll from war. So if we are going to place economic sanctions on Iraq, as happened throughout the entirety of the 1990s, the Western Allies might as well have been waging all-out war every single day. So there are two different kinds of sanctions. Firstly, there are unilateral sanctions, so sanctions that are imposed by one country, and that country is normally the United States of America. These are the most deadly. And then there are economic sanctions, which are led by which can be led by a coalition, normally a US-led coalition. UN sanctions, interestingly, showed no statistically significant effects, and the reason for that is hypothesized it is possibly due to greater oversight and humanitarian safeguards. So unilateral sanctions, which is almost exclusively American sanctions, between 2020 and 2010, I beg your pardon, and 2021, have led annually to 564,000 deaths. Okay, 564,000 deaths. Mainly children, mainly elderly people. Economic sanctions, the EU and the US and Canada and Japan and first world countries together have led to 629,000 deaths per year. And by the way, the unilateral sanctions could be anywhere up to 761,000 deaths per year. All global sanctions together create a combined 777,000 deaths a year. Okay? Which amounts to 3.6% of all deaths in sanctioned countries. The longer the sanctions, obviously, the greater the death toll. And mortality effects increase over time. So over time, if you, as happened in Iraq, sanction things like baby milk and incubators and all the things that you need to keep children alive with, then over time, the infant mortality rate rises the longer sanctions persist. Because obviously, as you downgrade hospitals and healthcare systems, what happens is their ability to repair themselves, to renew themselves, and the ability of healthcare professionals to continue functioning, because often they have to go off and find ways to survive, this becomes downgraded. This is, and if we look at it in a kind of historically kind of longitudinal way, this is one of the most powerful and devastating weapons America has had to cement itself as global hegemon throughout the post-war period. Long after its failed war with Vietnam, America imposed devastating sanctions on this country that it had already devastated. Its main tool against countries like Venezuela that choose a path of, however democratic or undemocratic you might think it, a path of national autonomy and won't fall in with the kind of the Monroe Doctrine. These are also devastated by economic sanctions, and the idea, of course, is that Venezuelans will eventually buckle under this breaking poverty and vote the right candidate back into power when they have the first available opportunity. This is essentially what happened with Nicaragua. It's a way of coercing populations into accepting American hegemony without having to go to the great trouble of deploying hundreds of thousands of soldiers, as the lesson of Vietnam had showed was really kind of a bit of a non-starter. So just to kind of continue, because there's so much to say here. So one of the policy implications drawn out here in the document is that sanctions, despite the fact that they are presented as a low-cost foreign policy tool, are not. They are certainly not to the domestic population. The way it's normally presented on Western news media is that countries like Iraq or Venezuela are being mildly inconvenienced. The population aren't as wealthy as they once were, and they're getting a bit narked about it. And they'll do the decent thing eventually and want to have kind of internal regime change. It says here, unilateral economic sanctions resemble weapons of mass suffering for civilians, particularly children. The study calls for restraint, reform, and rethinking of sanctions regimes, especially those led by powerful nations like the US. And I think there is where I sort of kind of part company a little bit, because what we're talking about is the routine application of essentially crimes against humanity. And I would argue that these are beyond reform. Mass civilian bombing is beyond reform. Mass civilian starvation, like we see in Gaza, isn't something you can ask the power in question to be a bit more circumspect about. This is surely, by any international measure, an illegal act. So let's talk about crimes against humanity. So a bit of kind of background here. So crimes against humanity were codified under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. They include acts committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. It includes extermination, persecution, and inhuman acts intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health. Okay? So sanctions could well fit into this definition if the following conditions are met. If they're widespread and systematic. Unilateral sanctions like those imposed by the USA can affect entire populations over decades, such as Iraq, Iran, Venezuela. The scale of 560,000 deaths annually per the 2025 Lancet study could meet that threshold, that widespread threshold. I would argue that it does. Directed against civilians, although not violent, sanctions are often deliberately target economies. Sometimes the argument is, well, we need to put economic sanctions in place to stop the country from arming itself. But it is impossible to separate out civilian and military technologies. Iraq was famous for, or sanctions against Iraq led by Madeleine Albright that referred to them as a price worth paying, included the refusal to import baby incubators. The technology, microchips could be stripped out for missiles, in theory. So deliberately targeting economies kills people. Knowing this will disproportionately affect health, food, medicine, and energy for civilians is a crime against humanity. Knowing that what you do will kill civilians indiscriminately is a crime against humanity. Knowledge and intent. Declassified documents and policy statements show that policymakers are often aware that sanctions lead to suffering. So again, when Madeleine Albright was presented with the stats on infant mortality in Iraq in the 1990s, she said, "We think it's a price worth paying." Okay? So she was not unaware of this and viewed it as being essentially worth doing. So this could be argued as intent, or at least what you might think of as reckless disregard. So, admittedly, no international tribunal has ever prosecuted sanctions as crimes against humanity. Partly because international tribunals and the sanctions as levers are embedded in the same system of I don't want to say global governance, because that's starting to kind of drift off into conspiracy theory kind of tendencies. But the whole point is that there isn't anywhere near enough global governance. But they're part of the same system of essentially kind of quasi or crypto kind of imperialism. the kind of imperialism we saw before the Second World War is replaced by this world of rules. Sanctions are framed as a sovereign alternative to war embedded in the UN Charter mechanisms. So the UN Charter does say that you can do these things. Proving harm to civilians is difficult, or proving not just harm to civilians, but the intent to harm civilians is difficult. I mean, it's always intent. The kind of the debates over Stalin's Holodomor, whether that was a genocide or not, always come down to what was intended. I mean, I'm far more a facts on the ground kind of guy here, and I'm about kind of outcomes. Sanctions are sort of as old as the international system that we exist in at the moment. Sanctions were first sort of suggested by Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference. Of course, during the First World War, both the British and the Germans had tried to blockade each other. The British had done it far more successfully, and Germany was starving by the end of the war. There's huge increases in infant mortality and destitution. One of the great sort of unnamed contributions to the end of the war is the famine brought about by the Royal Navy in Germany. So it's seen in 1919 as a non-violent alternative to war, and it just depends what you're classing as violence. The violent sanctions were largely failures during the interwar period. I mean, for example, during the invasion of Abyssinia, they were largely ineffective and unenforced, primarily because the French and the British made a deal between themselves to turn a blind eye to what Mussolini was doing, in the hope that Mussolini would join with the British and the French in opposing Hitler, which again didn't turn out very well. During the kind of the post-war era, there have been sanctions regimes on some countries for decades, never-ending sanctions regimes, such as countries such as Cuba and North Korea. And again, whatever you may think about those countries, whatever you may think about their regimes, the reality is child mortality, rising, increased child mortality. And in the case of Cuba and North Korea, attempts to circumvent that, because these are mainly kind of economic embargoes and unilateral embargoes, attempts to circumvent that and find friends elsewhere in the guise of China and the Soviet Union. In the post-Cold War era, though, when you look at the kind of the Iraq era almost, that's where we see not just economic sanctions, but comprehensive sanctions, a sanctioning of everything. It's even things that you could argue have virtually no economic value at all. Children's pencils. It comes down to that level of cruelty and sadism and the desire to punish. And again, that's how we wind up at this point of kind of where we have to look at sanctions as being, what they are. There are few examples of economic sanctions that even work. There are a few examples where what it is that is supposed to be achieved winds up being achieved.
Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack. Sure, you can post your job to some job board, but then all you can do is hope the right person comes along. Which is why you should try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them for you. Its powerful technology identifies people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. You get qualified candidates fast. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you what you're looking for. The needle in the haystack.
See why 4 out of 5 employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. That's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
there are few examples where humanitarian exceptions function and work. For example, there are financial organizations who, fearing the wrath of the US State Department, will refuse to even consider exemptions or exceptions in case they make a mistake and they are lumped in with kind of the terrorists, quote unquote. And then you have the thing that we can most compare the modern sanctions regime to, and that is the medieval siege. And the medieval siege was designed to kill the enemy without risking a single soldier, to break the castle's walls down, simply by applying, cutting off food, cutting off water, and waiting, starving economies into submission. And the thing is that often sanctions persist for decades and decades, long after any hostilities have ended, because the people in those countries simply will not vote or remove, disagreeable or disliked leaders from power and replace them with more acceptable faces. And so the UN Charter that was created in response to war and mass suffering now allows powerful members, such as the United States, to impose unilateral sanctions that bypass multilateral oversight. So, you look at the devastation that this causes across the global south, and it's equivalent to war by, and sometimes far in excess of the damage and the bloodshed that war causes, except almost invisible to Western audiences and people in the global north. Anyway, I'll put a link to the Lancet article below, but I hope you found that interesting, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. You'll take care now, and I'll be posting something soon. Take care now. Bye-bye. Oh, one last thing. I'm on holiday for the next 2 weeks, so there might be a few less recordings, but don't worry, it's the summer. We'll be resuming, September's the time, really, isn't it? Take care. Bye-bye.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/kidsandfamily. Just go to Indeed.com/kidsandfamily right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
Lies, exploitation, and the American dream turned nightmare. This is Big Sugar, a deep dive into the inner workings of the sugar industry. I'm Celeste Headley, and in a new podcast, I'm investigating a true crime story like no other about the men who risked their lives to cut sugarcane. In Big Sugar from iHeartMedia, Imagine Audio, and the teams at Weekday Fun and Novel, I'll unravel a decades-long fight to get justice.
If they were right, then these workers were owed tens of millions of dollars in extra wages.
Listen to Big Sugar wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.